April 1945. Berlin is dying. Across the ruins of the Reich, the thunder of Soviet artillery echoes day and night. The Red Army, 10 million strong, has torn a path from Stalingrad to the heart of Germany. Every street, every shattered building is a monument to 4 years of blood. But in this alternate world, Stalin is not content with victory. He looks west, across the Elbe River, where the flags of the Western Allies flutter in the spring wind. To Stalin, the war is not yet over. Not until Europe itself kneels before Soviet power. In our timeline, on April 25, 1945, Soviet and American forces met at the Elbe near Torgau, a symbol of alliance and victory. But in this world, the meeting never happens. When the first Soviet patrol reaches the river, they receive a radio transmission from Moscow, a single, chilling directive. Do not stop, continue west, secure all territory to the Rhine. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding the First Belarusian Front, hesitates. His men are exhausted, supplies are low, but the order is clear, and in Stalin's empire, hesitation is treason. By dawn, Soviet armored columns begin crossing the Elbe under cover of smoke. They push into what was supposed to be the American zone of occupation. At first, the Western Allies believe it's a mistake, a misunderstanding amid the chaos of collapsing Germany. But as the hours pass, it becomes clear this is no accident. The Soviet Union has launched an invasion of Western Europe. In Frankfurt, General Dwight D. Eisenhower receives the first reports with disbelief. Soviet forces, thousands of them, advancing westward, ignoring ceasefire lines. British intelligence intercepts field transmissions. Entire German towns occupied overnight, Red Army tanks moving toward Hanover, Magdeburg, even the approaches to the Ruhr. Winston Churchill, weary and cautious, sees what's happening immediately. For months, he had warned that Stalin's ambitions would not stop at Berlin. Now his worst fear is becoming reality. Within hours, an emergency message is sent to President Truman. The Soviets have broken through our agreed zones. Their intent appears hostile. Immediate consultation required. Truman, newly in office and untested in crisis, faces the most dangerous moment in modern history, and the atomic bomb is still not ready. The situation could not be more unequal. The Red Army in Europe, over 11 million troops, 20,000 tanks, and 13,000 aircraft. The combined Anglo-American forces in Western Europe, barely 4 million men, scattered, undersupplied, and exhausted. The Americans and British still possess superior air power, thousands of bombers and fighters. But their ground forces, stretched across occupied Germany and Italy, are in no position for a defensive war. Meanwhile, the Soviet juggernaut rolls west, unstoppable, disciplined, and fueled by vengeance. The world's greatest military alliance has turned to dust overnight. By early May 1945, Soviet spearheads reach the Ruhr Valley, seizing the industrial heart of Europe. In this alternate history, Germany, what's left of it, becomes a battlefield once again. Cities that had surrendered to the Americans now find Soviet tanks in their streets. Desperate German civilians, who had greeted American GIs as liberators, now flee westward in panic, terrified by the stories of what happened in East Prussia and Poland. In just 1 week, the Red Army controls nearly all of central Germany. Their next target, the Rhine. Eisenhower convenes an emergency meeting in Reims. The atmosphere is tense, maps spread across tables, red arrows creeping toward France. General Montgomery of Britain is blunt. If we don't stop them at the Rhine, we lose Europe. American generals agree, but the problem is manpower. They can't fight a land war against the Red Army without massive reinforcements, and the Pacific War is still raging. Truman orders immediate redeployment of divisions from Italy and southern France. US air bases in England prepare for strikes not against Germany, but against Soviet supply lines. The unthinkable has happened. The Second World War has turned into the Third. From his office in the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin watches as reports flood in. His plan is unfolding exactly as intended. He had always believed the capitalist powers were too weak, too divided to resist. The Western armies, he reasons, are exhausted, their people desperate for peace. If the Red Army can seize France before winter, Europe will fall like a domino. His ambition is not mere conquest, it is ideological destiny. A continent united under communism, stretching from the Urals to the Atlantic. Stalin writes to Molotov, "We have liberated half of Europe, the rest will not resist liberation for long." By late May 1945, the Red Army reaches the Rhine River. The bridges are blown, the crossings mined, but it doesn't matter. Soviet engineers, veterans of the Vistula and the Oder, build pontoon bridges under constant air attack. The skies above the Rhine are a storm of fire. American P-51s and British Spitfires dive through anti-aircraft bursts, strafing Soviet convoys. The Red Army responds with mobile SAM batteries and massed artillery barrages. It is the first direct battle between the armies of East and West. And it is brutal. France braces for invasion once more. In Paris, civilians stockpile food and flee south. The city remembers 1940 and fears what comes next. The Allies rush to establish defensive lines along the Moselle and the Ardennes, regions already scarred by two world wars. American tanks, Shermans, Pershings and Cromwells, take up positions against the advancing T-34s and IS-2s of the Red Army. But this is no replay of Normandy or the Bulge. The Soviets fight with terrifying momentum, using tactics refined through years of total war. Entire divisions vanish under Soviet artillery. Bridges collapse under the weight of tanks. The sound of war returns to the heart of Europe. By early June 1945, the Rhine River burns. Allied bombers darken the sky, striking Soviet pontoon bridges and supply convoys. But for every bridge destroyed, the Red Army builds two more. Zhukov's engineers work under constant fire, laying steel and timber into the churning water. The Soviets are relentless. They have crossed rivers far greater than this before, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Vistula. Now it is the Rhine's turn. At dawn on June 3rd, the first Soviet armored divisions breach the western bank. T-34 tanks roll through the smoke, their turrets swinging toward the French countryside. Behind them come waves of infantry, thousands of men who have fought from Moscow to Berlin, hardened by years of total war. The Western Allies throw everything they have at the crossing. American P-47 Thunderbolts roar overhead, strafing bridges and fuel trucks. British artillery pounds the eastern bank. But the Red Army keeps coming. By the end of the day, Soviet bridgeheads exist in three places, near Cologne, Bonn, and Dusseldorf. The Rhine, once thought impassable, has been breached. By June 10th, Soviet mechanized units pour into the Rhineland. The German towns that had barely begun to rebuild after Hitler's fall are flattened once again. American and British forces retreat in disorder, not from cowardice, but from sheer logistical exhaustion. Their lines are too thin, their supply routes too long. The Soviets, operating closer to their captured depots in eastern Germany, have the advantage of momentum and overwhelming numbers. In Frankfurt, Eisenhower's headquarters receives grim reports. Entire corps surrounded, communications lost, Allied prisoners taken. The unimaginable is happening. The Red Army is pushing the Allies out of Germany. And there is little to stop them from entering France. In London, panic spreads through the cabinet. Churchill demands immediate reinforcements from the United States, but Truman hesitates. The Pacific War still rages. Japan has not yet surrendered. Diverting men and material from the Pacific could cost thousands of American lives. But in Europe, the situation grows desperate by the hour. Radio London begins broadcasting evacuation instructions for British civilians in northern France and Belgium. This is not a drill. Allied forces are repositioning. Civilians should move south or west at once. The words echo those of 1940, a cruel reminder that history is repeating itself. Churchill writes in his diary, "The Iron Curtain descends not from Stettin to Trieste, but from the Rhine to the Atlantic." In Moscow, Stalin's propaganda machine roars to life. Pravda declares, Soviet forces continue their liberation of Europe from fascist collaborators and imperialists. The Soviet Union insists it is not invading, merely securing the peace. But the truth is clear, this is an all-out conquest. Soviet shock armies move west toward Belgium and Luxembourg. Konev's First Ukrainian Front swings south toward Austria and Italy, while Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front pushes toward the Netherlands. The Red Army moves like a tide, consuming everything in its path. Captured German tanks are repainted with red stars. Local communist partisans rise up to guide Soviet troops through familiar terrain. Within weeks, the front lines stretch from Denmark to Switzerland. By late June, Soviet armored columns reach the outskirts of Paris. The city is unprepared for war. After 5 years of Nazi occupation and only months of liberation, Parisians watch in disbelief as the thunder of artillery returns. French units under Charles de Gaulle try to mount a defense near the Marne, but they are hopelessly outmatched. The Soviet army fights like a machine, coordinated, ruthless, efficient. On June 28th, Soviet tanks cross the Seine. Paris, the city of light, falls for the second time in 5 years. This time, there is no German occupation, no swastika over the Eiffel Tower. Instead, a crimson banner bearing the hammer and sickle rises over the Hôtel de Ville. The image shocks the world. In Washington, Truman is silent for several minutes after seeing the first reconnaissance photographs. In London, Churchill weeps privately. The nightmare he had warned about has come true. Europe is falling to communism. As Soviet forces advance, millions of refugees flood the roads westward, civilians, soldiers, and surviving German POWs. The ports of Brest and Cherbourg are overwhelmed. Allied ships evacuate troops and civilians across the Channel under constant Soviet air attacks. For the second time in half a decade, British destroyers escort refugee convoys through the night. In 1 week, nearly 500,000 people flee continental Europe. Behind them, Soviet troops raise red flags in every captured town, from Brussels to Bordeaux. By July 1945, the entire European mainland, from Warsaw to the Pyrenees, is under Soviet control. Now, only one obstacle remains between Stalin and total domination of Europe, the English Channel. Across the water, British and American forces regroup and prepare for the defense of Britain. Airfields in southern England come alive again, Hurricanes, Spitfires and Mustangs lined wing to wing. Radar stations are reactivated, beaches fortified. It is 1940 all over again. But this time, the enemy is not Nazi Germany. It is the Soviet Union, and the stakes are even higher. The free world has shrunk to an island. President Truman faces an impossible choice. The Manhattan Project is weeks away from its first test. The atomic bomb is almost ready, but not yet operational. His advisors are divided. Some urge him to use it immediately against Soviet military targets. Others warn that doing so could ignite an apocalypse. Meanwhile, Stalin, emboldened by victory, sends an ultimatum through neutral Sweden. Britain must demilitarize. The United States must withdraw from Europe. The continent will be reorganized under Soviet guidance. The world teeters on the edge of the Third World War, and the nuclear age has not even begun. Across Asia, Allied commanders are stunned. In China, Mao Zedong praises Stalin's courage. In Japan, military leaders take desperate hope, believing the West is too divided to continue the war in the Pacific. And in the United States, the mood turns grim. Public opinion, weary of war, fractures. Half the country demands peace, the other half demands vengeance. American newspapers carry headlines that chill the world. Soviet army in Paris. Red flag over Europe. Britain stands alone again. By mid-July 1945, Soviet troops have reached the shores of the Atlantic. From Norway to Spain, red banners mark their triumph. But now, for the first time since the campaign began, the Red Army halts. Ahead lies the English Channel, a narrow strip of water separating Stalin's empire from the last bastion of Western resistance. The Soviet Navy, powerful on rivers and inland seas, is no match for the combined fleets of Britain and the United States. The Royal Navy still commands the Atlantic. The U.S. Navy, bolstered by the Pacific Fleet, controls the seas. For now, Britain remains untouchable. But Stalin's ambitions have never been limited by geography. In Moscow, the General Staff drafts a new plan, Operatsiya Krasny Storm, Operation Red Storm. The objective, to bring Britain to its knees through siege and air power. Soviet bombers, redeployed from occupied France, begin launching air raids across southern England. They target ports, airfields, and communication centers. The echoes of the Blitz return. The same cities that burned under German bombs now face the fury of Soviet Tu-2 and P-2 bombers escorted by Yak-9 fighters. London's skies blaze once again. Searchlights sweep through the night. Anti-aircraft batteries roar. But this time, the British fight with experience. The RAF, rebuilt after the war with modern Spitfire Mk-24s and American Mustangs, strikes back with deadly precision. Over the skis of Kent and Sussex, the world's two greatest air forces clash, Soviet pilots hardened by Berlin, British veterans forged in the Battle of Britain. The result is catastrophic on both sides. In a single week, over 1,000 aircraft are lost. But the Soviets can afford the losses. Their industrial base now includes all of continental Europe. As the war drags on, Stalin consolidates his control over occupied Europe. Communist puppet governments are installed in Paris, Brussels, Amsterdam, and Rome. Political opponents vanish overnight. From Moscow to Madrid, the continent falls under a new totalitarian shadow, the Iron Curtain fully realized. Soviet advisors seize radio stations and schools. Factories are nationalized. The Red Star replaces the tricolor and the Union Jack on captured equipment. The world witnesses the birth of a Soviet Europe. Across the Channel, Britain transforms itself into a fortress. Every dockyard hums with activity. Women and men who only months earlier celebrated victory in Europe now dig trenches, load shells, and patch uniforms. Churchill's government institutes full rationing again. Every ship in the merchant fleet is pressed into service. American convoys bring weapons, oil, and food across the Atlantic under constant submarine threat. Truman declares, "If Britain falls, the light of freedom will vanish from the earth." Across North America, the public rallies. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Toronto roar back to life, producing tanks and planes not for Japan, but for a second war in Europe. In the Pacific, the planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, is postponed indefinitely. American commanders protest, but Truman insists Europe is now the priority. The B-29 bomber groups assigned to Japan are redeployed to England. Their new mission: to strike Soviet logistics centers in occupied France and Germany. By August 1945, Allied bombers once again fill the skies over Europe, but this time their targets are Soviet supply lines. The campaign is brutal. Rail hubs in Frankfurt, bridges in the Ardennes, airfields in Normandy, all reduced to rubble. But Soviet anti-air defenses, bolstered by captured German technology, claim hundreds of Allied bombers in return. The skies of Europe burn red, not from Nazi fire, but from a new enemy. In the Kremlin, Stalin grows impatient. The Red Army has conquered the continent, yet Britain still resists. He fears the Americans will soon possess the atomic bomb. If he cannot invade, he must force Britain's surrender through terror and deprivation. Soviet submarines begin mining the Channel and Atlantic Sea lanes. Dozens of merchant ships are sunk within weeks. Britain's supply lines tighten. Food grows scarce. Power cuts become routine. Air raid sirens wail nightly across London, Liverpool, and Portsmouth. Yet the British spirit holds firm. Posters reading, "We beat Hitler, we will beat Stalin," appear across the country. In Washington, Truman faces mounting pressure to act decisively. The Manhattan Project has succeeded. The first atomic test, Trinity, has just taken place in New Mexico. For the first time, the United States possesses a weapon that can change the course of the war. But using it against the Soviet Union, a former ally, carries moral and political consequences beyond comprehension. Truman's advisors debate deep into the night. "If we don't use it," says one general, "we lose Europe forever. If we do," warns another, "we start a nuclear war that will end civilization." Meanwhile, intelligence reports confirm that Soviet forces are massing along the Channel coast. Thousands of landing craft are being assembled, a mirror image of D-Day, but in reverse. The world braces for Operation Sea Flame, Stalin's planned invasion of Britain. Late August 1945. Soviet artillery lines the French coast. Rocket batteries, modeled on the German V-2 design, prepare to bombard southern England. The British government evacuates children from coastal towns once again. Hospitals move underground. The Royal Navy patrols day and night, intercepting Soviet submarines and saboteurs. Then, on the night of August 30th, the bombardment begins. Thousands of shells rain down on Dover, Folkestone, and Portsmouth. Flames engulf the southern ports. The Soviet Air Force launches its largest assault yet. Over 1,000 aircraft cross the Channel. But Britain is ready. Radar picks them up within minutes. RAF fighters rise to meet them, and the night sky becomes a battlefield of fire and shadow. In one of the largest air battles in history, nearly 300 Soviet bombers are shot down, but dozens reach London, leaving the city in ruins once again. By early September, Britain is bleeding. Tens of thousands dead, cities in rubble, food running low. Truman faces the hardest decision in human history. He convenes his War Council and authorizes the plan codenamed Operation Sunrise, the atomic bombing of Soviet military concentrations in Western Europe. On September 10, 1945, a single B-29 takes off from a British airfield. Its destination, the port city of Le Havre, the primary Soviet supply hub in France. At 8:32 a.m., the first atomic bomb in European history detonates. A blinding flash lights the Channel coast. Le Havre ceases to exist. The destruction is total. 40,000 Soviet troops vanish instantly. Tens of thousands more suffer burns and radiation. For the first time, Stalin sees the limits of his power. Reports from his generals are confused and terrified. Entire divisions have simply disappeared. He orders immediate retaliation, but the Soviets have no comparable weapon. Instead, he commands massive artillery bombardments of Britain in revenge. But the tides of war are turning. American nuclear strikes continue, one on Hamburg, another on Bremen. Soviet supply lines collapse. The Red Army, stretched to its limits, begins to falter. By October 1945, Soviet forces in France and Germany are in retreat. Mutinies break out among conscripts who have fought without rest since Stalingrad. In Paris, communist militias try to maintain order as the Red Army withdraws east. Truman sends an ultimatum through Sweden: withdraw beyond the Elbe River or face total destruction. Stalin, shaken and enraged, realizes the truth: his empire cannot withstand atomic fire. The world stands on the brink of annihilation. October 1945. Europe lies in ruin again. Cities that had just begun to rebuild after 6 years of Nazi occupation are now smoldering craters. The Red Army, once unstoppable, staggers backward across the Rhine, hounded by Allied bombers and crippled by atomic strikes. The Soviets have lost nearly 2 million men in 3 months of fighting. Entire divisions vanish beneath the rolling firestorms of nuclear detonations. But even as they retreat, Stalin refuses to surrender. In Moscow, he orders scorched earth tactics across occupied Europe. Factories are dynamited, railways destroyed, food stocks burned. If the Red Army cannot hold Europe, it will leave nothing for the enemy to claim. By November, Soviet remnants dig in along the Elbe River, the same line that once marked the boundary between liberation and occupation. This time, it marks the frontier between life and annihilation. The Americans and British launch a coordinated offensive, supported by thousands of aircraft and hundreds of thousands of fresh troops from the United States and Canada. The ground shakes beneath the thunder of artillery. Tanks roll through towns already flattened by war. Every village becomes a fortress, every bridge a battlefield. The Soviets fight like cornered beasts, desperate, unyielding, fatalistic. But their supply lines are gone, their factories are dust, their morale has collapsed. By December, Allied forces reach Berlin. The city, once the capital of Hitler's empire, now burns under Soviet and American fire alike, a symbol of the endless tragedy of Europe. Inside the Kremlin, Stalin receives the final report from his generals. The Red Army can no longer continue offensive operations, ammunition exhausted, communications disrupted, morale disintegrating. He reads in silence. Then, as he has always done, he makes his decision alone. Stalin orders the evacuation of key Soviet officials to the Urals. Factories in Moscow and Leningrad are dismantled and moved east. He declares that the Soviet Union will fight to the last drop of Russian blood. But even his inner circle knows the truth: the Soviet war machine is broken. The atomic bomb has changed everything. In the skies above Eastern Europe, American bombers fly unchallenged. Their targets are no longer cities, but infrastructure, bridges, rail yards, airfields. Each detonation carves another scar into the heart of the Soviet state. Radio Moscow broadcasts defiance, but behind closed doors, panic spreads. Molotov whispers what no one dares say aloud: "We have lost Europe." In January 1946, Stalin disappears from public view. Rumors swirl, some say he has fled to Siberia, others that he was killed by his own officers. What remains of the Soviet leadership sues for peace through Sweden. Truman agrees to negotiate, but his terms are absolute. Soviet forces must withdraw from all territories west of Poland. Germany will be occupied jointly by Western powers. The Soviet Union must disarm its offensive capabilities under Allied supervision. The Soviet delegation hesitates until Allied bombers drop leaflets over Moscow, photographs of the ruins of Leningrad and Kiev, and a single message: peace or oblivion. On February 5, 1946, the guns finally fall silent. The New World Order is born in a neutral city, Stockholm. Representatives from the United States, Britain, and a shattered Soviet Union sign the Treaty of Stockholm, ending the Third World War. Europe is divided once again, but differently this time. The new borders carve a scar across the continent. Eastern Poland and the Baltic states remain under Soviet control, but the rest of Europe, from Germany to Greece, falls under Western reconstruction. France, half destroyed and irradiated, becomes the center of Allied occupation. Britain, though battered, stands triumphant, the island that refused to fall. The atomic age has arrived, and with it, the uneasy peace of fear. The victory is hollow. Tens of millions dead. Half a continent uninhabitable. Radiation clouds drift across the North Sea, darkening the skies of Scandinavia. Churchill calls it a peace won at the price of civilization itself. In the United States, the public rejoices at the end of war, but the images from Europe haunt the world. Cities reduced to dust, fields turned to glass. The once great capitals of culture, Paris, Berlin, Warsaw, now empty shells. The phrase, mutually assured destruction, is born from this devastation. Historians call it the day humanity learned the true meaning of power. In the aftermath, the Soviet Union implodes. Without its European territories, its economy disintegrates. Revolts break out in Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. By 1947, the USSR fractures into competing republics. Moscow loses control entirely. The Communist Party dissolves. Joseph Stalin, once the most powerful man on earth, dies in exile near Sverdlovsk, reportedly poisoned by his own guards. His death marks the end of an empire and the beginning of a new age. The United States emerges as the sole superpower. Its dominance in technology, industry, and nuclear weapons shapes the next 100 years. Europe is rebuilt under the Marshall Plan II, an even larger reconstruction effort than in real history. But this time, the goal is not merely to restore, it is to prevent humanity from ever repeating such destruction. In 1948, the United Nations Atomic Charter is established in Geneva, declaring nuclear weapons illegal for all nations except those under international supervision. For a time, peace holds. But deep beneath the earth, scientists continue to experiment. And as the Cold War never truly ends, the shadow of nuclear power remains. Historians later debate Stalin's fatal mistake. Some say he could have stopped at Berlin and ruled half the continent forever. Others argue that his ambition was doomed from the start, that total domination of Europe was impossible in the atomic age. What remains undeniable is this. Had the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe in 1945, the 20th century would have ended before it began. The destruction of Europe would have rewritten history. The Cold War, born not of suspicion but of fire, would have consumed the world itself. In the end, victory belonged not to the armies nor to the nations, but to the lesson learned in ruin. That power, unchecked, devours all who wield it.